Understood. I'll tighten the prosecutor dialogue and trim the repeated moral reflections to bring this into the 4,600 word range. Here is the revised, corrected script. The courtroom was cold that morning, and the cold had nothing to do with the temperature. Something had settled into that room overnight, something I've learned to recognize after 32 years on this bench. It sits in the air before the first case is even called, like the building itself knows what's coming. I've learned not to ignore that feeling. Before I tell you what happened that day, I need to say something to you directly. In 32 years, I've heard thousands of cases, and most of them I can barely recall now. And that's just honest. But there are a small number, maybe 24 in all those years, that changed the way I understand this job. This was one of them. I've carried it every single day since that Tuesday in October because it reminded me exactly why I chose this work. If you've ever wondered whether one person's story can actually change something real, stay with me. This one did. It was a Tuesday, late in October. The sky outside the tall courtroom windows was the color of old concrete, flat and gray and completely indifferent. The heating in the building had been broken since Sunday, and my clerk had tucked a small space heater behind my chair. It helped a little. The chill stayed. The morning docket was long. A docket is the list of cases scheduled for the day, and that morning it had 12 items before lunch, all code violations, property maintenance fines, the kind of work that doesn't feel important until you're the person standing on the wrong side of the bench. I've spent more of my career on cases like these than on anything else. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when my clerk set a new summary sheet in front of me. The number at the top made me stop, $11,742. That was the total the city was seeking from a single defendant for a residential property, for a yard and a fence and a vehicle in a driveway. I set the cup down carefully and read the number again. I've seen larger fines in my courtroom. But this particular number on this particular gray morning made me feel something I've learned over the years to pay attention to. Not sympathy, not yet, just a question. I wanted to know what kind of life was behind this number. I wanted to see the person before I processed the paperwork, and I wanted to understand it before I judged it. The room filled slowly around me. The court reporter settled at her small table and tested her equipment quietly. The bailiff stood near the side door with his arms folded, his eyes doing that half-closed thing that looked relaxed and missed nothing. At the prosecutor's table, 2 men in dark suits arranged their documents into precise stacks, photographs on one side, printed records on the other. They were prepared to build a clean, orderly case from numbers and dates and documented facts. The bailiff called the next name. There was that small collective shift the room makes when something new is about to enter. The side door opened. He walked in. He was a tall man, or he had been once. You could still see the architecture of it in his frame, the kind of height built from decades of physical work, bones and posture formed over a lifetime of being upright, but somewhere along the way that height had bent forward into something careful, a stoop that wasn't weakness, more like a man who had been compensating for something he carried that nobody else could see. He wore a blue button-down shirt that had been ironed. You could still see the pressed crease lines in the sleeves. Real effort had gone into that shirt that morning, but the collar was too big for his neck now. It sat loose around a throat that had grown too thin for the shirt that used to fit him. His trousers were dark and clean. His shoes were polished. He had dressed for this day the way a man dresses when he wants to meet something difficult with his dignity still on. His hands were the thing I noticed first and kept coming back to. They were large hands with swollen and scarred knuckles the way hands get after decades of real physical labor. The palms were rough and deeply creased. These were hands that had carried weight, built things, held things together. He held them loosely clasped in front of him now, like a man who didn't quite know what to do with them now that they couldn't do what they used to do. He moved to the defendant's table slowly and sat down with the deliberate care of a man who has to plan every movement. He placed a folded white envelope on the table in front of him and rested both hands on either side of it. He didn't look around the room. He looked straight at me, calmly and steadily, with clear gray eyes that were very tired, not frightened, not defiant. Tired in the deepest possible way, the way a person looks when they've already finished every hard conversation with themselves and arrived at some place of quiet on the other side. The lead prosecutor was a man named Webb. I'd seen him in my courtroom several times before. He was competent, well-prepared, and absolutely certain that his job was to apply the rules evenly and without exception to everyone, and I don't say that with sarcasm. I genuinely respect that conviction. He wore a dark gray suit that fit him precisely, tie straight, documents perfectly aligned. He was in every visible way the orderly counterpart to the man sitting quietly across the room from him. Webb stood and presented his case efficiently. The defendant's residential property had accumulated code violations over 22 months, overgrown vegetation exceeding permitted height, an inoperable vehicle in the driveway, structural deterioration on the rear boundary fence. The city had issued 17 written notices over that period, each one properly documented and delivered. The fines had accumulated on the lawful schedule. Webb said all of this without any cruelty whatsoever. He simply believed it was true, and he was right that it was true. I watched Raymond Cole while Webb spoke. He didn't shake his head. He didn't shift in his chair or object to a single thing. He just listened quietly with his hands resting on either side of that envelope, like a man hearing something he had accepted long ago and had simply come here to stand in front of properly. I asked him to stand and tell the court what he wanted to say. He stood slowly. He said his name was Raymond Cole, and he'd lived at his address for 19 years. He said he'd bought the house the year he retired from the Army, and he wanted to start there at the very beginning if I was willing to hear it. I told him to take all the time he needed. His voice was quiet and measured. He said he had served in the United States Army for 21 years. He came home to that house after his final deployment with a long list of projects he had every intention of getting to: the fence repair, the exterior paint, the gutters. He smiled a little when he said this, a small private smile, the kind you give to a version of yourself you can't quite get back to anymore. He said the first couple of years after retirement had been fine. He took care of the place. He got to know the neighbors. He was doing exactly what he'd promised himself he would do when his service was finished, living in his own house, on his own terms, in the quiet he'd spent 21 years earning. He said it the way you describe a time that belongs to someone you used to be. Have you ever watched someone hold themselves completely still because moving even slightly might mean losing control of something? I've seen it in this courtroom more times than I can count. But I want you to stay right here with me, because what Raymond said next is the part that changes what every single detail before it actually means. Don't go anywhere, because the story isn't finished yet, and it's about to become something else entirely. He paused. He looked down at the table. He said that about 14 months ago he had received some news. He used that word specifically, news. He said it the way you say something that still doesn't feel entirely like yours even after living inside it for over a year. He said the doctors had found something growing in his left lung. He said the name of it was long and he still didn't say it easily, but what it meant was simple. It meant treatment had made him profoundly weak for most of the past year. The yard, the fence, the vehicle in the driveway were not neglect. They were the physical record of a man fighting to stay alive inside that house. He said he had no family nearby. His daughter lived out of state, and he hadn't told her the full picture of how things stood. He didn't want her to feel she had to come back. She had young children of her own. He said this almost apologetically, like his own dying was a logistical inconvenience he was trying to manage so it wouldn't trouble anyone else. It was the most heartbreaking sentence I'd heard in a courtroom in years, and he said it like a weather report. I asked him about the envelope on the table. He looked at it before he answered. He said he'd written something down at home because he'd learned recently that when he tried to talk through something complicated, his thoughts sometimes got mixed up. He apologized for that quietly and without self-pity. He said he'd written it all down on a morning when his head was clear. He picked up the envelope and held it out toward me across the space between us. He asked if I would read it. Not him, me. He asked if I would read it out loud so that he wouldn't have to. I said yes. I opened the envelope carefully. The paper inside had been folded in thirds and was handwritten in dark blue ink. The writing at the top was neat and controlled, the kind of precise handwriting that comes from years of disciplined report filing. But as the letter continued down the page, the writing changed. The letters spread out. The lines began to tilt, like the sustained effort of writing had cost him something physical as it went on, and the page held the evidence of that cost. I began to read. He had written his full name, his total years of service, the assignments, the ranks, the deployments. He'd written names of places I recognized from difficult chapters of recent history, places most people in that room only knew from memorial walls and old news footage. He wrote about coming home from his last tour and not knowing at first how to live in the quiet, about buying that house because it was the first thing in his entire adult life that had belonged only and entirely to him, not to the Army, not to the government, his. I got roughly 2/3 of the way down the page, and I stopped. I looked up from the letter. I looked at Raymond Cole sitting at the defendant's table. I looked at his ironed shirt and the collar sitting loose around his thinned neck. I looked at his scarred hands pressed flat on either side of where the envelope had been. I looked at his steady, exhausted gray eyes, and I could not continue reading out loud. Not in that room, not in front of everyone, not without losing something I needed to hold on to in order to do the rest of what this moment required. I set the letter down. I took a slow breath. I turned to Mr. Webb and asked him to approach. Right now, I need you to stay with me, because what happened next wasn't just about one veteran and one set of fines. It was about the moment when a system built for the average situation meets a human being who doesn't fit any of its categories. This is the part that matters most, not just for Raymond Cole, but for everyone who has ever been processed by something that never thought to ask why. Please stay, because this is the reason I'm telling you this story. I asked Webb directly whether the city had been made aware of Mr. Cole's medical condition during those 17 notification attempts. He paused. He said, "Not formally, no." I asked what formally meant in this context. He said the city's standard process uses templates that don't include a way for recipients to flag medical hardship. I told him I understood the process. I asked whether he believed the system had been designed to handle a situation like the one in front of us. He said the system was designed to be applied fairly and consistently to every property owner. I said I understood that. I asked him to look at something with me. My clerk had pulled all 17 of the city's own inspection photographs from the file. I laid them in a row along the edge of my bench and asked Webb to look specifically at photograph 3. It had been taken 16 months earlier. It showed the front door of the defendant's house in early morning light. Hanging from the door handle was a hospital discharge bag, the thin white plastic kind they give you when they send you home after an inpatient procedure. The name on the label was clearly legible, Raymond Cole. Below the name was a discharge date. Through the white plastic of the bag, visible in the photograph, were 2 prescription bottles and what appeared to be folded discharge instructions. That photograph had been taken by a city inspector and placed into the city's own file. It had been in Webb's file since the day it was taken. It had been there the entire time. Webb looked at it in silence. Then he said that inspection officers document visible property conditions, not medical evidence. He said the process exists for good reason. I said I understood that too. Then I asked him whether he thought it was acceptable to fine a man for not mowing his lawn on the same calendar day the city's own photograph showed him coming home from the hospital. Webb said nothing. I set the photograph down. I looked at Webb and said something I want you to hear clearly. The law is a tool. That is all it is. An instrument built by human beings for human purposes. You use a tool to build something, to fix something, to help a person do what they cannot do alone. The moment it stops serving that purpose and starts doing damage, it has been misused. I've believed that for 32 years, and I've never stopped believing it. Webb made his final argument. He said dismissing this case would set a precedent. A precedent is when a ruling becomes a model that future cases refer back to. He said others would claim illness and hardship to avoid valid fines. He said the city's consistent procedures were what made the system fair for everyone. I looked at him steadily. I told him that equal treatment and just treatment are not the same thing. I told him that a system which places a dying veteran with 21 years of service in the exact same category as someone who simply can't be bothered has confused fairness with arithmetic. Justice requires us to see the actual human being in front of us, not just the violation they're attached to. I told him if he wanted to appeal my ruling, he was fully within his rights, but he would be making that appeal in my courtroom and in front of me. He sat down. I straightened the papers in front of me. I picked up my gavel and let the room hold its silence for a moment. Some silences in a courtroom serve a procedural function. This one served a human one. I needed everyone in that room, including myself, to be fully present for what I was about to say. I said this court found in favor of the defendant, Raymond Cole. I said the total amount of $11,742 in accumulated fines was dismissed in full, every dollar of it. I said the city would bear its own administrative costs. I said the record would reflect that the defendant had demonstrated both extraordinary personal hardship and extraordinary service to this country, and that this court had taken both into complete and unqualified account. I brought the gavel down. Raymond Cole didn't jump at the sound. He didn't stand. He didn't cover his face. He sat absolutely still for a long moment that felt longer than it was. Then he placed both his large, scarred hands flat on the table in front of him and pressed them down hard, like a man who needed to verify that something solid was still beneath him, like the floor had moved. He stared at his hands and held them there, pressed flat and still. Then slowly, very slowly, he lifted his head and looked at me. Just that. A long, quiet, steady look. No words. I leaned forward in my chair. I said his first name, not Mr. Cole, Raymond. I said it the way you say someone's name when you want them to know they were genuinely heard. I told him I had read his letter, all of it, and that I hadn't been able to finish reading it out loud. I told him that had nothing to do with him. What I read in that letter was the truth of a man who had given everything he had and then quietly kept giving until there was almost nothing left to give. I wanted him to know this court had seen that. Then I told him one more thing. I told him his daughter should know what was happening with him. I said I understood what he was protecting her from. But in 32 years, I had watched over and over what happens when that call doesn't get made in time. I told him that most children want the chance to show up. I said it quietly, not as a judge, as a person who has seen too many cases end the wrong way for the wrong reason. He nodded once, small and slow and certain. The nod of a man who already knew but needed to hear it from somewhere outside himself. Then a voice came from the back of the room. A man in a blue Postal Service uniform had been standing along the back wall throughout the entire hearing. I genuinely hadn't noticed him arrive. He raised one hand like a student and asked if he could say something. I looked at him for a moment. I said, "Go ahead." He said his name was Marcus. He said he had been delivering mail on Raymond Street for 11 years. He said that without exception, every winter for all 11 of those years, Raymond Cole had shoveled the front walkways of his own house and the 3 houses immediately beside him. He said Raymond did it before dawn, before anyone on the street was awake, before any neighbor ever knew it had been done. He said he knew this because he started his own route before sunrise and had watched it happen year after year. He said Raymond had done it this past winter too, even when it was visibly clear that holding the shovel took real effort. He said he wasn't sure of all the details of what had been decided in that room today. He said he just thought someone ought to know that about Raymond before whatever came next. I want to stay here for a moment before we move past this, because in my experience, this is the part of a story that matters most. Not the ruling, not the evidence. This, a man in a uniform standing at the back of a courtroom on his own time because he wanted a judge to know something true about a person. I've had attorneys argue brilliantly for hours and move me less than Marcus moved that room in under a minute. The law has real power. But human witness is something older than the law, and on its best days, it is more honest. 2 weeks after that October Tuesday, a reporter from the local newspaper published a short account of what had happened in my courtroom. It wasn't front page. It ran on page 7 of the print edition and appeared on the paper's website that same evening. By midnight, more than 600 people had shared it. I know this because my clerk printed the page the next morning and left it on my desk with a small yellow sticky note. The note said 4 words. Judge Carver, look. I looked. By the end of that first week, a small neighborhood fund had been set up in Raymond's name. Not a national campaign, not a viral moment, just local people within 10 or 15 miles of that courthouse. They raised $9,317 in 7 days. That number matters because it isn't round. You don't invent that number. That's the number you get when real people give exactly what they actually have. A retired contractor from a town about 30 miles away wrote to the courthouse. He said he had 2 workers free on a Saturday in November, and he wanted to fix Raymond's fence at no charge. Just tell him where to show up. My clerk wrote back with the address. He came on the Saturday he promised and brought 3 workers, not 2. The fence was finished by Sunday afternoon. An employee from the city's Veterans Services office came to see me informally in chambers about 10 days after the hearing. She said she hadn't known about Raymond's situation until the story ran. She said there were several assistance programs he qualified for that no one had ever directed him toward. She apologized. I told her the apology was decent, but the programs were more useful. She went and found Raymond directly and helped him access everything he'd been owed for years. 17 letters arrived at the courthouse over the following 3 weeks, addressed to Raymond Cole, care of my courtroom. My clerk forwarded everyone. I don't know what most of them said. I know what one said because Raymond told me about it 6 months later. A man he'd served alongside more than 20 years before, someone he had completely lost contact with, had seen the newspaper story and used the courthouse address to find him. He had written 3 full pages. Raymond said he had read those 3 pages 4 separate times. 6 months after the hearing, I was in the middle of a recess on a Thursday afternoon when the bailiff came to find me in the hallway. He said someone was asking to see me briefly, not about anything official, just to say hello. I walked out to the corridor. It was Raymond Cole. He was wearing a brown jacket, something structured and warm, the kind a man wears when he wants to look settled rather than formal. Not the ironed blue shirt with the too wide collar, a jacket that fit him. I noticed the collar immediately. It sat right against his neck. He was still thin. He hadn't transformed into someone unrecognizable, but the way he was holding himself had shifted in a way that's difficult to describe precisely, but is immediately visible when you've spent 32 years watching human beings stand in difficult rooms. The stoop was still there, but the weight behind it had changed. There was less apology in it now. He was standing like a man who had been reminded he had the right to take up his share of the available space. He had his daughter with him, a woman in her mid-30s with dark eyes and his same large hands, the same shape of knuckle and palm. She was holding a small container wrapped carefully in foil and held it out toward me the way you hold something out when the thing itself means less than what it represents. She said she'd made them herself. She had the look of someone who had cried a great deal recently and had made a clear-eyed decision to be done. I took what she was offering and thanked her. Raymond said he had called his daughter the evening of the ruling. That same evening, he picked up the phone and called her. She was on a plane within 2 days. He said he should have called her sooner. He said it plainly and quietly, the way you say out loud something you've already known for a long time but couldn't say until right now. And now I want to ask you something, not from this bench. As a person who has spent 32 years watching people carry too much alone for too long, is there someone in your life right now who is struggling and you've thought more than once that you should check on them, call them, show up, but the day keeps passing and you haven't yet? Because Raymond Cole almost ended as a number on a dismissal record. He almost finished as a file in a drawer. Instead, because one hearing went one particular way, he became the reason his daughter flew home. The entire difference between those 2 endings was a single phone call made on the right evening. Think about who in your life might be waiting for yours right now. That evening, I sat alone in my courtroom after the building had emptied out. The space heater was long gone. The heating had been fixed back in November, and the room was properly warm now. The evening light came through the tall windows at a low amber angle and lay quiet across the floor. I sat in my chair and I let the day settle around me. I thought about what this work has actually taught me over 32 years. People assume it's taught me the law. It's taught me some of that, but mostly it's taught me that the most important thing a person in this chair can do is see. Not process, not categorize, see. Every single person who stands in front of this bench is carrying a story the paperwork cannot hold. Some of those stories are about bad choices freely made. Some are about relentless bad luck. Some are about a whole life of trying, followed by one season where everything gave out. The file never tells you which one you're looking at. Only the person can tell you that, and only if you ask and actually listen. Raymond Cole told me the truth, not in the answers he gave to my questions, in the letter, in the ironed shirt he wore to face $11,000 in fines, in the way he placed that envelope on the table and asked someone else to read it because he wasn't sure he could do it himself. That was the truth, and the law gave me the tools to answer it the way it was always meant to be used, as an instrument for seeing people clearly, not a mechanism for making them disappear. I've been asked many times what I think justice really is. I used to give a longer answer. Now I give a shorter one. Justice is what happens when someone with power decides to see a person instead of a problem. I picked up my gavel, set it down one final time, and turned off the light. The room was empty, but it didn't feel that way.